Free Radio Hour is brought to you by Baen Books Audio Drama, presenting dramatized audio plays of the best science fiction and fantasy with a professional cast and cinema-quality soundtracks. Now available, Eric Flint's Islands, based on the novella by Eric Flint. Also available, Larry Correia's Detroit Christmas, based on the novella by Larry Correia, set in the world of the Grim Noir Chronicles at BaenEbooks.com. Just put Islands and Detroit Christmas in the search bar and enter a world of listening pleasure. Baen Books Audio Drama.
The Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, bloody hands and oil-stained rags spark a basement conflagration. Dwarves, elves, half-elves, horned halflings, and a star to steer them by. Plus, we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen editor Tony Daniel. We have part one of a fascinating interview with David Weber this time, who discusses his new addition to the Norfressa fantasy series. That's also known as the War Gods series to some, and the Bahzell Bahnakson series. But its official name now, according to David, is the Norfressa series, and the Bahzell books are the Bahzell cycle within that. And this novel, The Sword of the South, begins a new cycle, which David is calling the Kinhoden cycle within the series, although Bahzell is certainly in this book. We have a really fascinating discussion with David about the book, and that's coming up. If you want to have a look at a great four-color map to this fantasy world that David has created, we have it online. David discusses the map in the interview, by the way. You can find the map at www.baen.com/sosmap.jpg. That's baen.com/sosmap.jpg. So check that out. Also, we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky. But first, here's the news. We have some great free fiction and nonfiction on the Baen.com website this month. We have two new short stories. First, we have a new story by Robert Buettner, creator of the Orphan's Legacy military science fiction series. Those books include Overkill, Undercurrents, Balance Point is the last one. Bob worked for the Marathon Oil Company for a while, and his life experiences, he says, informed this story. But only the ridiculous parts are true, according to Bob. Bob claims that he knows where Big Oil has hidden the 100-mile-per-gallon carburetor, but if he told you, he would have to kill your hybrid. It's really an excellent story called The 100 MPG Carburetor and Other Self-Evident Truths. We also have free fiction from David B. Coe in his Case Files of Justice Fearson Contemporary Fantasy Universe. His Father's Eyes, which is book 2 in the series, is out in August, and this story is an excellent prequel to read to give you a taste of what's to come. The story is called New Moon Wolf. And for nonfiction this month, we have David Drake discussing how he came to share a byline with the great boys book adventure writer Jim Kajalgard, who was the author of Big Red and other novels. Out in August is an all-new edition of David Drake and Jim Kajalgard's The Hunter Returns, which expands one of Jim Baen and David's favorite boyhood books, Fire Hunter by Jim Kajalgard. The essay is Dave Drake at his droll best, so check that out. And check out the 100 mpg Carburetor and Other Self-Evident Truths by Robert Buettner, New Moon Wolf by David B. Coe, and David Drake's aptly titled essay is called Slaughtering Early Humans for Fun and a Slight Profit. Those can all be found at Baen.com. Here is part one of a two-part interview with David Weber discussing the new Norfressa high fantasy novel that takes place in the Bahzell Bahnakson universe. The book is The Sword of the South. We'll have the conclusion of the interview next week. I want to welcome David Weber back to the podcast. Hi, David.
Hi, Tony.
David Weber is the creator of the internationally best-selling Honor Harrington series and the Honorverse within which that series is set, beginning with On Basilisk Station. Weber's Honor Harrington science fiction novels have sold millions of copies. David is also the author of many other Baen books and a couple of series with other publishers somewhere. David has 17 New York Times bestsellers, maybe more. That's constantly changing, and we're revising it upward. And there are over 7.5 million David Weber books in print. David has a big fat fantasy series published by Baen. Previous volumes have featured that massive Haradani barbarian, champion of the war god Tomanak, husband to a Suthoi. Is she a shield maiden or a war maiden?
A war maid.
Lyanna. And they're not usually allowed to have husbands, but I guess when you marry Bahzell, exceptions are made. The books include Oath of Swords, The War God's Own, Wind Rider's Oath, and War Maid's Choice. Now, it is 70 years later in the series time frame. I think that's right. And there's a new entry that marks the beginning of an all-new story arc within the Norfressa setting. That book is The Sword of the South, and it's now available at booksellers everywhere.
Let me before we go any further, Tony, let me check some pronunciations with you, and then maybe we need to start over again here.
That's okay. Well, I don't mind you correcting me on air, because so many people read, fantasy novels, and they don't know how to say them until the author says them anyway. So.
Well, it's Bahzell.
Yeah.
Serves the war god Tomanak, and Lyanna is a Suthoi wind rider.
Okay.
Well, actually, she's a Suthoi war maid who also happens to be a wind rider, although that's an unusual set of circumstances. But she's an unusual lady, so,
All right. Well, I've been writing ad copy for this series since it began, so it's nice to finally know how to pronounce these things.
We've exchanged emails on them, but we haven't actually spoken to each other about them. So you've never heard me pronounce them. But that's why there's the vowel marking over the A in Tomanak and the O in Suthoi.
Ah, those aren't just affectations. That's how you say it.
That applies to all of the places where they turn up.
Yeah. David, you and I had an email exchange about how to classify this entry. The Sword of the South is, among other things, about the coming into his own of another character, who is the mysterious Kinhoden. So, in the book, it's a dark and stormy night as we begin. This red-headed dude is wandering through the port city of Belhaden, very wet, very confused. What can you tell us about him? And how do you say Belhaden?
I say Belhaden, but,
Let's not call the whole thing off, though.
Well, at the moment that we meet him, we don't even know what his name is, and he's not aware of the fact that he doesn't either. He's going to turn out to be very important to the series and to the entire world of Norfressa, which Norfressa is one continent of. But aside from the fact that he's a guy who has what appears to be rather selective amnesia, and that he is very important to a lot of the big players in the upcoming war. Can't tell you a whole lot more without spoilers that extend well beyond this book.
Sure. Well, we know he's a pretty good fighter. I think that's fair to say.
Well, yeah, that becomes evident pretty early on. In fact, for folks who have read the existing Norfressa novels, I think of this as the Bahzell cycle and the Kinhoden cycle. That's how I divide them in my own mind between. And the Bahzell cycle isn't necessarily done. There's still at least one other book I want to write there, but you know. Anyway, the Kinhoden in some ways is actually, although he's only like 6'6", whereas Bahzell is like 7'9" and flourishes his great sword around one-handed and everything else. In many ways, Kinhoden is actually more dangerous in a fight than Bahzell is. Kinhoden himself doesn't really recognize that, but Bahzell does.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to be in Kinhoden's point of view when he realizes just how good he is.
Yeah, well, and it's not something that he should be glad about being.
Right, yeah.
He doesn't remember who he was or where he came from. He's got scars all over him, which indicate that he's had a fairly violent past. He's got an awful lot of scars for somebody who's like maybe in his 30s. And when he discovers that he has additional skills besides just fighting. For example, he discovers that he is a highly skilled musician. But the one that worries him is this combat skill of his, because he doesn't remember acquiring it, and that means that he doesn't remember what he did in the process of acquiring it. He has no clue how many people he may have killed in his life, and the fact that he can't remember doing it strikes him as a pretty poor excuse or defense if somebody calls him on it, or if he calls himself on it, because he simply doesn't know. And he falls in with Winsent of Roum, the most powerful wizard in the world, quite possibly the most powerful wizard in all of history. And it's clear that Winsent does know all the things that Kinhoden has forgotten. He knows who Kinhoden is. He knows where he got the skills. He knows all this stuff. And he won't tell Kinhoden. He can't tell Kinhoden, or at least Kinhoden has to decide whether or not he can accept the fact that Winsent truly can't, as opposed to won't tell him. But Winsent does promise him, and he promises by his own art, which is a pretty potent oath for any wizard to swear, that if they both live someday, Kinhoden will know everything that Winsent knows about him and understand why Winsent is doing what he's doing. And so Kinhoden has to decide whether he can put enough faith in Winsent to accept that. And it's not easy for him.
No, especially because Winsent will not promise that he's going to survive to find out.
One of the things about the entire world of Norfressa is that the way that the cosmological explanation for what's going on here is sort of, I guess you could say it's sort of quantum physics in a way, because the nature of the war between good and evil in the novels ultimately leaves the decision for which wins in the hands of the mortals who have to choose whether they're going to serve the light or the dark. And the gods don't know what's going to happen. Not even the gods know, precisely what's going to happen in any given strand of reality. You have all these parallel universes, you can think of them that way, in which you have a gazillion Bahzells. And in each of those universes, that universe's Bahzell has to make choices. And his choices contribute ultimately to the choices of others, the decisions of others, how things work out in battle, and so forth. But until you reach the tipping point where the war between good and evil is decided by which one now controls what you might think of as a critical mass of the universes, nobody knows what's going to happen in any single reality. The gods can see all of them, but they don't know which one applies to this particular universe. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is part of the decision-making process. Ken Houghton's decision, his choice as to what he's going to do with this information that Winsett can't tell him is part of it. But even if Winsett could see the future in detail, Winsett couldn't tell him whether he would live or die. Now, there is a group of people in Norfressa who can see the future that will occur to them and those around them. They are magi who have the talent of precognition. However, precognition is much, for want of a better term, shorter ranged than would be necessary to tell Ken Houghton whether he's going to survive or not. Precognition is very focused. It will tell the person who has it certain things which they may or may not be able to fully control. It will tell them things that will definitely come to pass for their strand of reality. But it doesn't have the ability to see all possible outcomes or reach beyond a fairly short temporal horizon. And then there are the dragons. We meet one of them in this book. And the dragons are kind of like the gods. They can see all possible outcomes of their own actions and how they will interface with. And as they move along their life experience, the possibilities for what future they will experience narrow, because you go past different points where you could have branched off and gone somewhere else. But the dragons know what's going to happen maybe an hour and a half before it happens. What is actually going to happen to them, maybe an hour and a half before they get there, depending on how momentous it is. There are some things that they'll know because the forces in play are so big, so powerful, that there are only a limited number of ways it could work out, if you see what I'm saying.
There's a really cool, using the metaphysics, it's a really cool attack that happens in the book with the Shadow Warriors. Well,
that ties into the whole, there are other realities, other universes out there. The Shadow Warriors, the Shadow Mage, they're basically recruited from another universe. And Winsett doesn't know for sure which universe they came from. He just knows it's not this one. There's no way for him to know this, but they probably came from a universe in which the struggle has already been decided in favor of the dark. That's where demons and devils tend to come from when they're summoned into Norfressa, is they're coming from a universe in which the dark has won, and they have these powerful servants who they can bring across, assuming that they can get by the gods of light to transfer between universes. The most powerful entities in these dark universes cannot cross into a universe where the struggle hasn't been decided yet, because they're so powerful that they can't hide themselves while they're trying to sneak across between the realities. So even as powerful and nasty as the demons and the devils that Bahzell has faced in the earlier books are, they're actually not the first tier of servants of the dark in the universes where the dark have won. The devils tend to be more powerful than the demons. They're kind of at the upper edge of what you can get across without having Tomanek or Isvaria or somebody swat them on passage. You can think of the shadow warriors, the shadow men, as this is going to sound bad, but as sort of low-rent demons that are being pulled across by a wizard rather than by a deity.
Yeah, well, it's a really cool fight scene that results.
Yeah, right.
So to get back to the physical reality of the place, Kinhoden wanders into this really cool tavern, the Iron Axe. You have this great description. There's like all the races of men are there, hanging out. Stocky dwarfs, brush-shouldered with ivory-horned halflings, and the tall, broad-shouldered men of the northern provinces. What are the races of men?
There are certain fantasy tropes that you're going to pick up and run with, and I think fantasy writers have tropes is a word that's overused almost as much as paradigms, but I digress. That are building blocks of a fantasy, and I think it depends in part on what your take on them is. My take on them is that there are 5 races in this universe which are considered the races of man. They are all interfertile. They all came from the original base stock, apparently, somewhere along the line. And they are humans, dwarves, Redani, elves, and halflings. There's also a bunch of folks called the half-elves, but they are not considered a true race of man because they don't breed true on their own. I mean, they do for a generation or two, and then they have to infuse new genetic material from the what I think of as the donor races to make it to sustain their existence. The humans are kind of the generalists of Norfressa. They don't, they're not the great engineers. They're not this. They're not that. However, every wizard ever born has been either human or half human. There have never been any wizards who were elvish or who were dwarvish or who were halflings, or certainly not Redani. The Redani tend to be very physically powerful. They tend to be tall, although the horse stealer Redani, the northern Redani, like Bahzell, are by far the tallest. They're the biggest and the most powerful. Bahzell refers to his friend Brandark, who is 6'2", as Little Man. And when you think about the fact that Bahzell is over 1.5 feet taller than he is, you can understand why he would be doing that. But most other people really, really wouldn't call Brandark. He's about 6'2" and probably about 6 feet across the shoulders. I mean, yeah, you wouldn't really call him little, but Bahzell does and gets away with it because it's true. But the Redani were used as shock troops by the Dark Lords down in Kantavar, the southern continent, where everybody in Norfressa came from originally, in the war that toppled the empire of Adavar and caused everybody to refugee out to Norfressa. They were basically enslaved by the evil wizards, the Dark Wizards. And when they didn't want to cooperate, the wizards used sorcery to compel them to drive them into a frenzy. And what the wizards didn't really realize, because they don't think in these terms, is they were genetically engineering the Hradani to have this trait, which the Hradani call the rage, which can take them whether they want it or they want to or not. But the Hradani also, and this predated the Dark Wizards starting to mess around with them, the Hradani are directly linked to the magic field. Essentially, if you look at how magic works in Norfressa, what they're doing is they are manipulating the basic nature of matter, the energy that all matter ultimately is made out of, using metaphysical tools rather than physics. But what they're doing in many cases has ramifications that could also be described in terms of our physical understanding of the universe, so that the trait that drives the Hradani into this frenzy is genetically coded into them. And it's just that the wizards who wanted to produce that result don't think in terms of genes. They think in terms of, this is the result that I want. And that's how they get. Same thing happened to transform the coursers out of standard war horses to give them the link to the magic field and the intelligence and so forth. When the Wizards of Light set out to improve the war horses of the Adavaran cavalry, they didn't realize all the ramifications of the genetic changes that they had set into motion until the coursers emerged as a fully sentient species in their own right. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. But to get back to the races of man, human, Hradani, and dwarf were the three first races of man. And the thing that distinguishes the dwarves from anyone else is that they are the only people who produce Sarnasic. And these are stone herds, if you will. They can command stone. They can shape it. They can fuse it. They can cut tunnels through it by exercising this power. And so, in a sense, they're touching the magic field directly in this one limited fashion. The elves were once humans, but thousands of years ago, when Adavar the Great was creating the empire of Adavar down in Kantavar, there were a bunch of guys who had a natural affinity for the magic field. They were not wild wizards like Winston who can touch it directly, but they used it in a natural, instinctive way that was very dangerous. And they agreed, the current elves' ancestors agreed to exchange their gift for touching the magic field for effective immortality in a working performed by Adavar and his wife Gwynitha. He's Adavar the Great, she's Gwynitha the Wise, and they're the ones who put the kibosh on black wizardry 10,000 years ago. And the elves are the result of that manipulation. Nobody knows exactly how the halflings were created. Winsett believes, and he's probably got the lowdown on it, if anyone does, that basically you might think of the halflings as being radiation-induced mutations. They are the descendants of servants of the wizards in Adavar, who were simply exposed to so much magic that it changed them genetically into a distinct, different race. And so when somebody talks about the races of man in Norfressa, they're talking about all of these groups. They're also talking about the half-elves but the half-elves are not considered, as I say, a distinct race, which pisses them off. Now, when the nasty racists in Norfressa are the half-elves. Because they have to periodically introduce human or elvish blood into the bloodline to maintain who they are, et cetera, they prefer to think of themselves as superior to both. They only live like 500-600 years, not forever like elves do, but they have the practicality of humans, et cetera, so they're better than either of the parent stocks. And the rest of the world is fine. You can, classify yourself however you want. No, we don't consider you another race of man.
Well, that sounds like a huge inferiority complex working itself out, but let's not. Well, all right. So what about the present, the Iron Axe? Who are the proprietors? And how did they get to this point? Bring us up to date, basically, on Bahzell and Leanna and what's going on at the moment as we start the book.
People who are going to read the books and want to be surprised shouldn't listen to this part of the podcast, because it's one of the little twists here in the book is for people who know it to try and figure out what the heck is going on. When Kinhoden discovers just how old Bahzell and Leanna actually are.
Yeah. We're a good ways ahead of the end of Warmaid's Choice, right?
Oh yes, several decades. The Iron Axe is a tavern which is owned by Bahzell Bahnakson and his wife, Leanna Fressa, also known as Leanna Flamehair, et cetera, who are our old friends Bahzell and Leanna from Warmaid's Choice. The real reason that they have the tavern, Bahzell these days is the swordmaster of the Belhaden chapter of the Order of Tomanake. So he's kind of got, I think of it as having a teaching position when he's not out doing research and experiments in the field. You know what I'm saying here? Theoretically, I mean, he's a prince. His family is filthy rich now, especially with the canal that we were building in Warmaid's Choice. He really doesn't have to, quote, work for a living, close quotes, but that's not how his head works. And he and Leanna have a daughter, Gwenna, who is about 10 or 11 when we meet her. And she is half human and half Redani. And this means that she is going to probably be facing some prejudice from bigots of both races. Plus, being a hybrid of those two species, she's likely to live as long or longer than a half-elf. But she's infertile. The cross between human and Redani is sterile, which, as Winsett points out at one point in one of the earlier books, is probably just as well for the rest of the races of men, because if they could reproduce as a sixth race of man, the human Redani cross would be really, really dangerous. They get long life, they get the Redani link to the magic field, and because they're human, they're potentially wizards. So it's kind of like, okay, just as well we don't have them stacked 12 deep out there, in the lobby. But one of the reasons that Bahzell and Leanna own the Iron Axe is that Bahzell deliberately set out to create an environment in which Gwenna would be exposed to the world at large from a very early age, so that she could grow up in as close to a normal lifestyle as anybody whose father is a champion of Tomanake and whose mother is a war-made commander of 1,000 and daughter of one of the 4 greatest nobles in the Sathoi kingdom. As close to normal a childhood as someone like that could possibly have. And his whole object in doing this is to while he and Lyanna are still alive, to build for Gwenna that sense of security and self-knowledge of who she is that will allow her to continue when, 150 years from now, even people who are members of her family and who the children and the grandchildren, people who knew and loved her, will still see her as this sort of figure out of legend and maybe resent the fact that was here before they were born and will still be here centuries after they're gone, kind of thing. Lyanna is not as concerned about that as Bahzell is, but that's because Bahzell has had the experience of dealing with the prejudice against Radani, which makes that entire race of man, like outcast in the eyes of the rest of Norfressa. And Bahzell will do anything to protect the people he loves. He'll do anything to protect almost anybody, but especially the people that he loves. And he's committed himself to trying to protect Gwenna as much as possible from the damage that kind of hatred can do. There's also a secondary reason why they want to be specifically in Belhaden while they're doing this that also relates to Gwenna. But we're not going to talk about that right now.
All right, but it does form a significant and really cool subplot in the book. So we do find out more about that.
Yes, we do find out in the course of the book why they're where they are, it's a significant element in the plot of this book, and it is an element that will become even more significant as the series progresses. I'll just say that.
All right.
If anybody's going to be intrigued by that and decide that on the basis of that they'll buy the book, good on them. Good on them.
Well, it'll be fun to see what the kid of Lyanna and Bahzell is up to.
Oh, she's a handful. I'll tell you that right now. I really enjoyed the scenes where she's interacting specifically with Bahzell when he goes off on the adventure, tells her to be good and mind her mother while he's gone, and she says, "Like always, Papa," and he says, "Don't you like always me? I said behave." It's like Bahzell has the daughter he deserves in every sense of the word. And Lyanna too. I mean, Lyanna doesn't get to go adventuring very much in this book. Trust me, that will change in future books. But the reason that she can't ties in with the reason they're in Belhaden to begin with. That's probably enough.
All right. Well, let's talk about another important character in the book, who is Winsett of Roum. He wants Kinhoden to accompany him or to go on a quest. He really can't tell Kinhoden what the quest is quite yet. Without getting into any spoilers, this is the culmination of 1,500 years of planning by Winsett, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. Part of the problem is, I think I can. Okay. One of the big reasons that Kinhoden isn't being told who he is by Winsett is that it's really, really important that the bad guys not know who Kinhoden is at this point. Because if they knew who he was and what was going on, what Winsett has in mind in this book, if they knew, then the wizard lords down in Cantavar, despite the fact that they're afraid that, to backtrack slightly here for those who have not read the books or haven't read them in a while, the earlier books, when the Wizard War in Cantavar, when Torin Swordarm, the last of the Audavaran emperors, and his army were destroyed after a 40-year rearguard action to allow as many people as possible to refugee out to Norfressa. Winsett and the Council of Ottavar basically carried out a strategic nuclear strike on the continent of Cantivar, from which they'd refugeed out, and they couldn't kill all of the wizard lords because, to put it in 21st century terms, their fallout shelters were too deep. They were all up down under Cheyenne Mountain. Okay. But they pretty much killed everybody in New York and Los Angeles, and the infrastructure that would have supported a follow-up attack on Cantivar, including the vast majority of the weaker wizards. And once those spells are activated, they can be reactivated by somebody with sufficient power. Winsett, who was part of the original working. Well, Winsett was part of the original working, and he's a wild wizard. And therefore, Cantivar has been unable to do anything that might provoke him into doing this all over again. They know that the Council of Carnadosa, who run Cantivar and who have been rebuilding for, it took them like 1,000 years to recover from what Winsett and the White Council did to them, really. But they know that Winsett is still haunted by all the millions upon millions of people who got killed, most of whom were slaves, not evil inherently, not by choice. Many of them had chosen to give themselves to the dark, but others simply had been taken. They had no choice, and he and his companions killed them anyway. So they know that he really, really, really doesn't want to do this again, but if they push his back to the wall and he sees it as the only way to protect Norfressa, they know that he's done it once and he'll do it again. The question that is exercising the mind of the head of the Council of Carnadosa at this moment, though, is whether or not Winsett still has the power to do it. He has the capability in that he has access to the spells, to the working that made it possible in the first place. But it took 300 members of the White Council, most of whom died in the process, to make it work the first time around. And so they don't know for sure whether or not Winsett can do it. So basically, it's been a Cold War situation with the Cantivarans, the Carnadosans, not daring to push too openly against Winsett because they don't know if he still has the capacity to strike their continent again. And part of what's going on in this book is that the council has set this up to test Winsett's power, to try and set up a situation in which he'll have to give them an indication of whether or not he still has the capacity to use the spells against them. So Winsett knows that this is part of what's going on in their minds down there. And he also knows that if they knew who Kinhoden is, and if they knew what Winsett is planning to accomplish in the course of this book, this quest, that they might very well take the chance on forcing him one way or the other without a test in order to kill Kinhoden before Winsett can pull it off. And so that's one reason why he literally cannot tell Winsett. He literally cannot tell Kinhoden because, for various reasons that become clear in the book as we go along, he can't block the scrying spells from Cantivar that would be able to pick up on that information if he gave it to Kinhoden. And in that case, all hell would be out for noon, and Winsett's not ready for that yet either. Winsett is maneuvering very carefully here, more carefully than a lot of people realize, and he's been doing it for a very, very long time.
Well, you called him a wild wizard. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, okay. Okay, there are three varieties of people who can use magic in Norfressa. There's witches and warlocks. Witches and warlocks think of them as hedge wizards. They can give you a healing charm. They can do, that kind of stuff, but they can't really do the heavy lifting of magic. That they have a natural affinity for the arts, sort of like the ancestors of the elves did, but nowhere near as powerful. And because it's a natural gift for the art, they don't study the art the way that other wizards do. And as a result, since they don't study it that way, since they use it so naturally, they never really become as powerful as they might be because they don't learn the technique to make the best advantage of this natural field that they have. Okay, well, next you have wand wizards, who are also known as sorcerers or sorceresses. And they are people who have a substantially lower natural feel for the art than the witches and warlocks do. And they can't do it sort of instinctively the way that the warlocks do. They have to learn how to do it, and they learn certain limited, specific applications of the art, as it were. They learn combinations that they can put together to create more complex spells. They can do things that a warlock would only dream of, but it requires very careful preparation on their part. They're manipulating forces which can destroy them in a heartbeat if their control wavers, and they have to learn the processes, the procedures, the mnemonics that are involved in making all of this work. But they can be very, very powerful, but they spend a long time studying and most of the dark wizards that you're going to run into are wand wizards who took shortcuts to limit the danger to themselves at the expense of others. And they can be very, very powerful, but they also automatically, if they pursue those shortcuts, wind up on the dark side of the equation. And then the final bunch of wizards are wizards like Winsett, who are wild wizards. And wild wizards are kind of like warlocks and witches on steroids. They can literally see and manipulate the energy of the magic field, which is the energy that binds the entire universe together. They operate, if you will, on the molecular, the atomic level. They can, a wild wizard who really wants to, could pick up a piece of rock and dissolve it into its constituent atoms by manipulating it on that level. Part of what happened in the Strafing of Cantavar was, in effect, Winsett using his wild wizardry as part of the working to accomplish what, for all intents and purposes, was atomic fission or even nuclear fusion, backed up by the life force of his fellow white wizards. So the thing about wild wizards, though, is that when they're born, they have like zero affinity for the art. I mean, they can't, they're like, and wild wizardry is inherent in them, but what awakens it is an internal process. And usually it is desperation. When someone who has the potential for wild wizardry is up against something that he just can't accept, that this is something that he cannot allow to happen or whatever. His back is against the wall for himself or somebody he cares about, something like that. It's like an interior barrier goes down. And the power of wild wizardry kind of floods into him. And the problem is that unless he knows what it is and can figure it out real quick, it basically consumes him in that moment. Now, probably consume everything else in the vicinity, you understand. It's messy. But it's, and it seems to be a rule of wild wizardry that anyone who thinks he has the potential automatically doesn't, or else blocks that potential in himself. Nobody knows for sure if it's that the way it works. Not even Winsett knows, but that's the way it seems to be. So, in a duel with another wizard, for example, going back to the fact that wild wizards are very elemental personalities, in a duel with another wizard, the wand wizard would be using combat magic that's been worked out ahead of time, spells that he or she has learned, possibly prepared ahead of time, or whatever. And a wild wizard basically just reaches out, grabs the magic field, and just throws raw energy at his opponent until he pretty much turns the opponent into a greasy spot on the pavement. And this means that wild wizards are the wizards who are most feared by other wizards. And there have been very few of them. Ottavar the Great was a wild wizard. Winsett is a wild wizard. There have only been a handful of others. And one of the points that Winsett's, I don't think he addresses in this book, but it's one that will be addressed eventually, is it's hard for Winsett to know how many wild wizards there might have been if the wizards in question if the individuals in question had realized what was happening and been able to grapple with it when it suddenly burst in on them. There are some similarities there between the mage crisis that the Magi undergo when they grow into their psionic powers. They experience a crisis in which they have to their brain in effect has to open new channels for them to be able to deal with what's suddenly rushing in on them from the rest of the universe around them as their perceptions shift and change. There's a little similarity between that and what a wild wizard goes through.
Mm-hmm. And wild wizards also have very freaky eyes.
Well, yeah, that's how you can tell they're wild wizards. Their eyes. Nobody has actually seen Winsett of Room's eyes in like the last millennia and a half or so. Millennium and a half, sorry, singular. Because they reflect the magic field that is now part of the wizard. He's always attached to it, like Radani is, only more so. And it manifests in his eyes becoming these flickering, glowing, shifting colors sort of thing. Upon occasion, you'll actually, if you're looking at Winsett in profile, you see like little specks of the same wildfire from his eyes actually breaking free and drifting upward, kind of thing. Yeah, it's kind of cool if you're into that kind of thing.
That was part one of our interview with David Weber discussing The Sword of the South. Part two and the conclusion to the interview will be available as part of next week's podcast. Now we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky. This portion of Under a Graveyard Sky is provided by Audible.com. Get the complete audiobook at Audible.com now. If you're not a subscriber, you can get the entire audiobook free or choose from more than 100,000 other titles when you try Audible free for 30 days. Now here is another segment of John Ringo's novel of zombie infestation and the heroic humans who fight back, determined to pull the world from disaster and humanity itself from the brink of annihilation. It's all taking place under a graveyard sky.
Chapter 6. "I didn't create the virus," Tim said. The room was windowless, and since he'd been transported with a bag over his head, he wasn't even sure where he was. And good luck with getting a lawyer. The ride had also made him puke all over his lap and shoes, which wasn't adding to his day. "All I did was prove it was possible to express two different—" "All we want is the vaccine, kid," the FBI agent said calmly. "I didn't make the virus," Tim screamed. "If I had the vaccine, I'd have vaccinated myself and my mom." "You've got all the materials in your basement, son," the agent said, still calmly. It wasn't like the geek could get violent chained to a chair. "So just explain how to make the vaccine." "Ah!" "There is no RNA or DNA related to the pathogen in this material," Dr. Karza said, shrugging. His team had run every stored microorganism in the suspect's lab in world record time. There was lots of other stuff, but exactly 0 was pathogenic. Fascinating breakthrough. Brilliant. Really brilliant. But it has nothing except background science to do with the actual pathogen. "You didn't get it right the last time," Agent Schornauer said. "Why do we trust you this time?" "You want to figure it out, tough guy? Bottom line, except for pure scientific aspects, this is a dead end." "We'll determine that." The FBI director looked at the report and grimaced. According to not only the CDC point people, but FBI labs, there was 0 evidence that this Shull kid had any background, contact, or access to the Pacific flu. There was lots on his computers, not to mention his blog, the YouTube videos, which he'd actually found really useful explaining how this bug worked, about dual expressionism. What there wasn't was a scrap of the actual bug or any references to it. All the kid had worked with was non-human pathogenic materials, mostly something called coliphage lambda, whatever the hell that was. There was less evidence of H7D3 in the Shull home than in, say, the front lobby of the J. Edgar Hoover building, which another report had just noted was lousy with the stuff. He decided to let the Attorney General and the Bureau's lawyers worry about it. "There are still conditions under which he could be a questionable actor," he typed into the memo. "Change his status to material witness and give him to the CDC. Keep somebody on him and don't let him slip away." "My client is only guilty of an extremely important scientific breakthrough." Dr. Curry thought you really had to love the caption. "Pacific Flu Killer's Attorney." They didn't even have the poor attorney's name displayed. "The FBI has shown no proof that my client had any part in creating the flu." Which, from everything Curry was scanning, which was probably more than the attorney was being given access to, was true. Or at least the only part the kid had played was breakthrough synbio, which meant he was going to have a fun time convincing the DOJ he wasn't guilty. Assuming the world didn't come apart entirely, the upside was that he'd be able to sue the crap out of the federal government and get more scholarships than you could shake a stick at. Right now, that didn't look likely. "And I'll remind the media of the FBI's record in high-profile cases. Richard Jewell, a hero, who was arrested and immediately publicly condemned. Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a researcher assisting the FBI who was publicly charged in the anthrax case." Great way to make friends there. "Shull isn't your culprit," Dr. Dobson said wearily. "We're still trying to determine his part in this," the FBI Deputy Director for Terrorism replied. "His part was to create one of the necessary technological conditions," Dobson said, as patiently as he could. "That's it. He made a breakthrough. The same thing could be said for dozens of professional researchers. You might as well indict Alfred Nobel for every IED in Iraq. And I'd really prefer you didn't lock them all up. We need them. As we need Shull. He's an expert on dual expression. Nobody had even looked at it before he did. So sure, keep him in custody, but if you don't put him on a plane to Atlanta by the end of the day, I'll let you explain it to the news media and the president, and I want my people talking to him within the hour. He didn't make the virus, but he understands it in a way we don't. The Department of Education has mandated a total shutdown of all public and private schools starting Monday. School's out for summer, Dr. Curry crooned, looking at the latest spread graphs. Only Sunday, and they'd gone from dots on the West Coast to spreading red in every reporting zone across the globe. And the Save the Planet deodorizers had been found in dozens of public locations stretching up and down the eastern and western seaboards. Somebody had been a busy little beaver. School's out forever. Okay, first of all, Dr. Garza said, shaking his head at the scene in the interrogation room. Get him out of the cuffs. Doctor, just get him out of the cuffs, you dick-brained myrmidon, Garza snarled. He's not going to be able to think if he thinks he's on the way to Gitmo, and we need his brain. He waited until the agent had released Scholl and left. Idiots, Garza said, shaking his head again. I mean, not actual idiots. They're smart, they just aren't biosmart. And that scares them. And I didn't literally mean we need your brain, just in case you were wondering. I didn't make the virus, Tim said, rubbing his wrists. Please, I really didn't. I'm worried about catching it. I know, Garza said, nodding. My lab processed the hell out of yours. There were 0 pathogens in your lab, and I'm pretty sure, from the looks, you hardly ever went out. And eventually, they'll figure the same thing out. I really don't, Tim said, hunching up. Not since I left school. Sorry about the master's thing, Garza said, shrugging. I know Dr. Werda. He's a dick, and not nearly as important as he thinks he is in the field. I'm Dr. Azim Garza from the CDC, by the way. And while I'll admit you have more problems than I do, try being the lead investigator on a bioterror attack while being Islamic, born in Iran and with a name like Azim Garza. I can imagine, Tim said, chuckling and sniffing at the same time. Your mom is fine, sort of, Garza said. She's been released and she's gotten you a lawyer, who, for all sorts of Patriot Act reasons, isn't going to be able to help you anytime soon. On the other hand, CDC is on your side. We get how the DOJ reacts in these sort of things. They think about the perp walk and calming the public because just because you have the culprit, the plague is going to stop all by itself. We react differently. Which is why I'm here. We're going to be moving you to Atlanta pretty soon. Not the pen, to CDC. FBI and DOJ are still going to be going apeshit and asking all sorts of questions you can't answer. That's because they don't know which questions to ask. We know you don't know how to make a vaccine, or a cure, as the FBI keeps insisting. They've been watching too many movies. What's the cure? They don't like, there isn't one, even theoretically. But what we need is your knowledge of dual expression. So what we'd like you to do is go with the flow for the time being. You're under arrest, but as of this point, you're also one of our research associates. Until DOJ can get over the he had to have made the virus, they'll probably insist on treating you like a criminal. Let them. Cooperate with them. Be polite. Keep your head down. If we, that meaning the CDC, can possibly get one of our people along the whole time, we will. And he or she will be there to both pick your brain and keep the fibbies from getting berserk. Let your lawyer work on getting you out, and work with us on finding a vaccine. Deal? At the very least, it's going to make their argument that you must have done it because you can a little weaker. The term is cooperation. Goes loads with judges. Absolutely, Tim said, nodding vigorously. I mean, a chance to work with the CDC on this is like a dream come true. I really, really want to help. Good, Garza said. Good. Now, how in the hell did you get a DNA virus to express an RNA virus? That right there was effing brilliant.
That was another segment in our complete audiobook serialization of Under a Graveyard Sky by John Ringo. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And a gratitudinous sword arch formed by 1,000 wind riders and their courser steeds, so massive that the city of Belhaden charges for tourists to go up in it and see the fleet of ships lying offshore in the Belhaden roads. For David Weber, author of new Norfressa fantasy novel, The Sword of the South. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.